Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I've been away for a while, I do apologise. Last time we did Icon and today we are back with the girl group relay we're going to do with CLC. Let's go. Firstly, I just want to apologise that I've been on for so long. August has been a very busy, heavy, intensive month with a lot going on, so I do massively apologise. And I know you guys from now on want a lot of girl groups. That's what we're going to do in future, and then afterwards we'll focus on the main vocalist and soloist kind of vocal analyses. Okay, so CLC all the way through weren't the most incredible vocal group I've ever heard in my life, but they're all pretty solid, pretty decent all the way through, and their technique's all quite obvious to work out and explain exactly how they use their voices. So without any unneeded padding or further ado, let's just get into the vocal rankings that you guys have missed and that I've missed doing, so let's just go. CLC vocal ranking. Okay, so from everybody in CLC, Eunbin is clearly the one that sings the least and has the least developed technique and is the least confident singing all the way through. She isn't necessarily bad by any means, she's just the least developed vocalist, let's say. That's what you're saying. Okay, so with a positive, I just want to preface this all with Eunbin's voice for what has been showcased is very pretty. It's got a nice phonetic quality and the timbre's perfectly pleasant. The only issue her voice really has is it isn't got much in the way of dynamics. It's not hugely technically proficient all the way through. It doesn't really showcase much in the way of any sort of mixing, any real incredible head voice ability, or anything really more comfortable than one particular thin coordination. So all the way through her voice, firstly she looks kind of nervous when she sings. She's like, I don't really want to be doing much of a vocal pass. I'm going to put in like the bare minimum that works on my particular vocal tone. And her voice is very thin. It's very naturally breathy. There's a lot of extra air in the sound, which means that coordination isn't very chord closure heavy. It doesn't really have much in the way of dynamics it can go into. It hasn't got a huge spectrum of sound or phonetic qualities that it can really access. So mainly she stays in this very kind of like very relaxed, kind of comfortable place. There's a little bit of tuning issues here and there. It doesn't sound like it's the most comfortable in terms of staying on pitch or staying on key. Having said that, it sounds perfectly pleasant and it doesn't really have much in the way of cracking or kind of huge placement issues. It's just not really a lot to it. She sings in a very thin, light coordination that works kind of in the middle of her voice because her voice is clearly naturally a little bit higher pitched. And when it works in that area, it sounds comfortable, it sounds thin, and it sounds easy. But because it's just a thin, naturally breathy coordination with not much chord closure, there isn't really any way to kind of get that feeling of a mixed place or get into a really higher area using any kind of vocal dynamics or very impressive technique. She has a fairly okay head voice because her voice is naturally so thin in coordination, and when she goes in there it sounds perfectly pleasant, but there just isn't really a lot to it and it sounds kind of a bit limited. It's perfectly stable and perfectly fine and sings in that very comfortable place, totally okay, just lacks really anywhere to go, which is the only real problem with her voice. It's not hugely varied and it's a little bit limited and doesn't have the best tuning on earth. It sounds perfectly pretty though, but yeah, she isn't the world's strongest vocalist. Okay, for somebody regarded as kind of like a bit of a badass rapper in a female group, Yeeun's singing voice is really cutesy and really pretty and really light and really thin. It's not dynamically incredible, but it's perfectly pleasant. Let's watch her sing.
싫어진 거잖아. 마지막 순간까지 좋은 사람으로 기억되고 싶어. 누가 말하던지 I don't care. 네 편견은 아름다운 밤에 숨겨 no thanks. 알랑이는 머리 너에게 그 말이 미워. 보다 순수한 나의 머리 까만색 어둠은 싫어. 내가 찾던 하동화처럼 속 나쁘지 않은 기분. Baby, a 54 combo to boot to light blue. Well, I wait up for you. 아쉬운 너의 맘이 털어놔 물작장난. So 2, 3 다 준비해 모두 그곳으로 다
Okay, so Yeeun's singing voice is kind of pretty interesting. It's got a little bit more in the way of projection and kind of dynamics to a point than Eunbin's does, and it has a little bit more in terms of variety. Her vocal tone is again naturally very thin and very pretty. She uses quite a wide mouth a lot of the time, which makes everything kind of sound a bit like that, a bit tight and a bit thin, almost Disney princessy almost. She has a very thin and relaxed vocal tone. Having said that, when she goes up into a higher place, she actually accesses her head voice kind of pretty efficiently, and that really light coordination she has all the way through gives her this feeling in this upper area of ease and stability. The only real issue with Yeeun's voice is it has a pretty noticeable tuning problem. It doesn't really stay on pitch super efficiently, and it does kind of fall away from the key of the song quite a bit. Having said that, the actual pitch she stays in sounds perfectly stable, and she sounds very comfortable in her vocal tone, and she doesn't really try and force anything that she knows that she can't do. When she kind of stays a little bit more connected down a slightly lower area, it sounds perfectly comfortable, again with a slightly thinner, wider coordination, but it doesn't sound too bad. And as she goes up, she doesn't really bring up any chord closure for really dynamic mixed voice or anything kind of in the way of power vocals or huge projection, but she does have a lot more projection and kind of consistency than Eunbin does, and has a bit more presence in her vocal tone. But as she goes up, she kind of alleviates the chord closure and sings with naturally more thinner, lighter coordination, which is why her head voice work is pretty decent, because it has that feeling of being thin, but because the chord closure isn't really brought up into a higher space, that lacks the dynamic potential and the power potential of her vocal delivery. So all the way through, Yeeun's voice is thin, it's light, it's nice, it can kind of get into a bit of a higher area and access this kind of cutesy, head voicey, thin, mixy sort of area, but doesn't really have much in the way to go into in terms of dynamics or really good low notes or really good power vocals or anything like that. All the way through, it's a little bit more varied than Eunbin's voice, but still hasn't got much in the way of technically incredibly impressive singing, but her thin, naturally lighter coordination does sound really pleasant and gets into a higher area, relatively efficiency, with the odd tuning issue here and there. Okay, so for me, these next two people could kind of be interchangeable to a point, but to me, Yujin of the two has the less varied vocal ability because of how her voice naturally is and how she naturally uses it. It's still a perfectly pleasant voice. Let's watch her sing. Okay, so Yujin has actually got a pretty decent voice in terms of accessing a higher area. Her vocals a lot of the time sit in this higher key really easily and really comfortably. That's because her voice is a naturally thinner nasal placement, and as she kind of uses her voice in its natural setting almost, she has a very, very easy time in a higher key in these higher areas. When she's singing in high notes, she can often bring up a really kind of thin, naturally easy coordination and make it sound super sustainable, super comfortable, and really quite pleasant up in this higher area. However, because it is a thin, light coordination which lacks a little bit of chord closure, I have had the stability fall off here and there a little bit, where it sounds a little bit shaky, but that's quite endemic of people that use a very light, thin coordination, because as nice as it sounds to be light and to be thin, it does lack the grab of chord closure, which makes stability and tuning just that much easier. But having said that, Yujin's voice, and she brings it into this higher space, sounds really comfortable, and occasionally she brings up a little bit of chord closure to make the kind of sound a little bit beefier, a little bit bigger, with a little bit more connection and projection, and it sounds pretty pleasant and pretty good in this kind of higher place. Again, there is the odd thin kind of stability issue here and there, but it sounds perfectly pleasant and works pretty well in this higher area. The main issue with Yujin's voice is because it is quite nasal and quite high pitched naturally, the nasality thins out all the way through, but because she doesn't really use a great deal of chord closure, the middle of her voice and the lower end of her voice kind of suffer a little bit, which means that she lacks kind of variety in terms of everybody else coming up who have significantly more of a spectrum to work from for me. So Yujin's voice, basically, the low notes are kind of non-existent because her voice is so naturally thin, high-pitched with that nasal placement and that thin coordination, which stop her having much in the way of projection in any kind of lower place. The middle of her voice isn't super stable or super consistent because again it doesn't really have access to that area with the chord closure. Then as it gets to a higher, thinner place where a lot of girl group songs in K-pop are written in this high soprano key, she does really good things because her voice works naturally really well in that higher area because of the thinned out nasality and the kind of naturally thinner coordination that she does use. And then occasionally she brings up a little bit of chord closure for a nice kind of more full open sound, be it a little bit tight and nowhere near as consistent as the guys coming up, I would say. So Yujin's got a pretty nice voice, works really well in the higher area, just lacks kind of much variety because it's so naturally thin and high. Okay, so to me, Seungyeon might not be the world's greatest lead vocalist, but she's pretty solid. But can I also mention how bloody good a dancer she is? I know it's nothing to do with dance. When I was researching, I was kind of blown away by how good it was she is dancing. But yeah, her vocals are pretty decent, pretty solid. Let's watch her sing. Okay, so Seungyeon's voice, so far of everyone I've mentioned, is definitely the most varied, most versatile, and has the most kind of technical places it can go into based on her natural speaking voice. Her voice is really naturally kind of deep and husky and a lot thicker than everybody else I've mentioned so far. So she has to work a little bit harder to get into a higher place, and for the most part she does pretty well with the odd limitation here and there. Okay, so first of all, when she's singing kind of a lower area, it's very comfortable, very natural, and she has by far the best low notes of everyone I mentioned so far and among the better in the group. Her voice is a little bit thicker, it's a little bit huskier, in this lower area it works pretty well. The main issue here, however, is that Seungyeon kind of sings all the way through her range with a little bit of extra air. That air is used to kind of thin out the vocal tone all the way through to match the kind of higher key of this CLC kind of singing the majority of the time, which kind of makes her voice in the lower end pretty decent, but it has the odd tuning issue here and there because again, if you use a naturally kind of thinner area configuration, then your tuning can fall off a little bit because it's much easier to kind of stay on pitch and stay in key with a bit more chord closure and a bit more chord grab. Having said that, she just kind of stayed down low, sounds pretty decent and pretty consistent. As she brings up into a higher space, she does kind of one of two things. Either sings again with that really heavy airflow, which makes it thinned out all the way through to get into this higher area, and the middle of her voice is accessed pretty efficiently, but it doesn't always have the most consistency because when you sing with an actually area configuration, it's a pretty inconsistent sound to get right all the time. And when she does kind of add a little bit more chord closure from down low, because she is used to using a lot more air, it can sound a little bit tight and a little bit squeezed. When I was looking at her pre-debut, she had a little bit more in the tank in terms of a kind of bigger mixed place. Again, it sounded a little bit pulled because her voice is naturally a little bit lower, singing these higher keys. But it seems that since CLC, she's started to sing it with a lot more air in the sound to kind of match these keys, which has made kind of singing easily and softly in the middle of the voice a lot easier, a lot more consistent, a lot more efficient. But it also makes it kind of a lot harder to have a naturally big, full mixed voice, which is the only issue her voice really has. As it goes up, it starts to sound a little bit pulled and a little bit squeezed because it is used to having a little bit more air in the sound, but that's kind of necessary to thin it out and you've got a naturally thicker, deeper voice. So I think she does pretty well considering the biological limitations her vocals give her for a soprano key, but there is the odd issue here and there because she does sound a little bit tight and her voice lacks a little bit of stability in the higher area because of naturally area, breathier configuration she does often use. But her voice is pretty decent and by far the most varied so far. Okay, so while I was researching, it didn't say that Sorn was a lead vocalist, it said that she was a sub-vocalist. That makes no sense. She's got a really, really nice voice, particularly for this kind of key of music. Let's watch her sing.
Love you was a promise. 서로 걸었던 거리에 아픈 계절의 향기와 너를 보여줄 수 있게.
Okay, so Sorn's voice was very interesting. She had a really big strength that I didn't see her use a whole ton, but was amazing. And then she had another strength that she used quite a lot more and quite a lot more often. Okay, so the first strength I want to mention is her lower notes were actually really developed and really quite good. There's a few performances I saw here and there where she stayed quite thick and quite heavy with a good bit of chord closure, and her voice sounded really smoky and really jazzy. Like the lower end of her voice was kind of not accessed a huge amount, but sounded really pleasant, really full, and had a really nice dynamic that certain people in the group didn't always have. Sorn also sounded quite a lot of thinness and kind of light coordination with a lot more air in the sound, but to me, of everyone's voice I've mentioned so far, her voice took to it the best and gave her the most in terms of dynamics to use because of that. So as I say, because she kind of had a naturally thicker, lower, smokier tone that, yes, she didn't use a whole ton, but was definitely there. Her voice had a bit of chord closure. It knew that feeling. So as she kind of went up into a higher space, she could either bring up a little bit more weight, and while again it wasn't the most open, full sound I've ever heard in my life, she had a bit of a mixed voice that she could access from time to time with a bit more chord closure, a little bit more projection, a lot more than everyone else I've mentioned so far in terms of consistency. But a lot of the time, she used a naturally thinner, lighter coordination, but she had a little bit of chord closure, so she used a bit of a laryngeal mix. Now again, laryngeal mixing isn't the most kind of efficient way of doing things, like the ha kind of thing that I do sometimes, where you're singing a little bit from the throat, but you're getting into a higher space pretty easily. Sorn's voice did that quite a lot. When she used projection and went into a higher place, it was very heady. There was a lot of thinness and lightness and airiness in the sound, but she also projected pretty well. And to me, of everyone so far, her voice had the most spectrum to work in terms of how she used it, because she utilized air and thin, light coordination by far the most efficiently, because she had a little bit of a feeling of chord closure from down low. As I say, her natural kind of balanced mixed projection wasn't exceptional. She really excelled kind of down low and smoky and a little bit lighter and thin and beautiful, or she had like good control in a higher kind of headier place. She didn't have that really dynamic, beautiful, consistent mix right in the middle like the next two guys coming up do, in my opinion. But Sorn's voice all the way through was really nice, really solid, accessed high notes pretty efficiently with the odd little bit of stability issue because it was a bit thinner and lighter, and a little bit of pulled sound because of the laryngeal mixing, but also really nice low notes because of the smokier, darker, more chord closure heavy sound that she did implement on occasion. So yeah, Sorn had a really nice voice to me, just not quite as dynamically optimum as the next two guys coming up. Okay, so to me, the next two people coming up are the ones in CLC that have the best mixes and the most dynamic vocals and the best projection and power vocals, basically, in my opinion. Elky, of the two, is slightly less controlled in certain areas, but her voice is still powerful, big, and really nice. Let's watch her sing.
싫어진 건가요?
Okay, so to me, Elky kind of had two singing modes, and the reason that she isn't number one for me is because one of them is great, and one of them was not quite as good as number one's is, who also kind of had two singing modes based on how CLC kind of performed a lot of their songs. Okay, so Elky's main vocal strength is she has great projection, a really wonderful mixed voice, and a really good power potential in terms of the dynamics that she utilised. So again, a lot of the time when she's in kind of light mode, she could sing a light, naturally thin coordination, and she had the tuning down probably the best of everyone so far that I've mentioned in this configuration, because her voice took to it really well, sounded really nice, and all the way through her range she could make it kind of bigger and fuller and have a little bit more thinness in sound if she chose to do that. Because of that, in a higher space, she had pretty good access to head voice, which means she had a decent passage navigation, not as good as number one, who's controlling that area was very good, but we'll get to that in a second. But she could sing in a lighter, thinner coordination pretty well, but it wasn't kind of what she was known for. It wasn't her most optimum vocal tone. The thing that made Elky really good is she used chord closure, and she used it very efficiently. She's one of two people in this group, in my opinion, that have a really consistent full mix, which is why her voice sounds so big, so powerful, is because when she's singing in a kind of a middle of her voice, instead of using just naturally light, thin coordination all the way through, or flipping straight into kind of a head voice, or doing a really cutesy sound, she has an open, full, big belt sound. Now, obviously, belting can be a little bit pulled and a little bit squeezed if you're not using it efficiently, but she uses it really well. She sings with a nice open throat, nice clear throat, and when she's in the middle of her voice, that chord closure she brings from down low, the nice forward placement she implements, gives her a bit like kind of noise. She has very, very, very good vocal projection. Of everyone so far, kind of sings a little bit airy, a little bit light, and sounds like they're kind of struggling to really stay much bigger. Elky does not have this problem. Her voice sounds really big, really open, and really full. And she, to me, has probably some of the better power vocals in this group, by far, because of that chord closure that she implements from down low. As I say, the only reason she isn't number one is because when she sings in that naturally lighter, thinner coordination, it's not quite as natural, and there's the odd tuning issue here and there, and the stability falls off now and again when she isn't singing with this kind of more forward, full grab. So that's the only issue with Elky's voice for me, really. It's not quite as perfect in terms of staying thin and light as number one's is, and has a little bit of kind of pull tension above where her mixed voice works really well. She doesn't have that upper mix to go into by making the placement slightly more forward, using a bit of nasality to thin things out, or putting it into the head. She just stays balanced in that big place in the middle that works really well for her voice, but doesn't go much higher than that much efficiently. Okay, that's why I think Elky's number two, because she's not quite as perfect in certain things as number one, but her voice is still really, really, really good. Okay, so CLC's main vocalist is Seunghee. It's no surprise that she is number one. Of everybody, her voice takes to the softness really well and the power really well, and she has the most varied, beautiful instrument in my personal opinion. Let's watch her sing. Okay, so I'm going to preface this by saying, for anyone wondering, Seunghee isn't the most incredible main vocalist I've ever heard in my life. She doesn't have insane, crazy power vocals that some people do have. However, all the way through, her voice is by far the most polished, by far the most varied, and has the access to the most things that work really, really, really well. Like Elky, she kind of has two modes of singing, the kind of CLC thin ballady style, where everyone's kind of naturally thin, light coordination. Her voice takes this pretty well. Her voice does sound better when it's got more fullness and more power in terms of a mixed place, but I'll get into that in a minute. But when she's thin and when she is light, she does sound really pleasant, and because she works in this area, her head voice is by far the best in this group. Her passage navigation is the most flawless in this group by far. When she accesses the kind of area of her voice sounds by far the best here. It doesn't sound like it's got a stability issue. The thinness isn't a huge problem. There isn't cracking or a lack of stability. It just sounds really good, really piercing, and really strong. Seunghee's main vocal strength, however, is her open, full mixed voice. She has by far the most controlled mixed voice in this group. Elky's is really good and works in a really certain area in the middle of her voice with a lot of power. Seunghee's has this area of voice down as well, with a nice kind of chord closure that she brings from down low, which is interesting because her low notes aren't the best in the world, but with a soprano vocalist, a lot of the time they won't be. The chord closure will access the vocals a little bit higher up in terms of where they sit in the range. But her voice sounds very, very, very good when she brings the chord closure from down low into this middle space. But as well as that, she has this ability to kind of go into a higher place as well. She will thin the vocal tone out, maintain the chord closure, place it slightly more forward, and like this bigger, higher kind of belt. She doesn't only have one belt in the middle, which is balanced really nice like Elky does. She has that down to a T without much tightness in her vocal tone at all, and then access a little bit higher to another belt on top of that. So for me, Seunghee's voice is by far the most dynamic all the way through. It's the most flawless all the way through. It's got a beautiful vocal tone, and yes, it might not have crazy power vocals in sustainability or things in that really, really high echelon, but she has a beautiful vocal tone, has a really nice mixed voice in the middle with her placement. She can access a little bit higher when thinning out the vocal tone a little bit as well, and also has a really good passage navigation into this kind of higher space with this lighter configuration, and just sounds all the way through very polished, very nice, and just a caramel honey voice almost. It's just really sweet to listen to, but also has good power potential and very good control. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I know it's been a long time and I do still massively apologise for that. We're going to be starting a girl group really, as I said. From now on it's going to be girl groups pretty much from here on out until I do the BTS video remake. I haven't decided who I'm going to do next. I'm going to look back at that post that I put out saying who do you want from girl groups. I'm going to make a little poll based on the ones that kind of pique my interest the most. So wait for that poll. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you so much for watching guys. Goodbye.